Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to the 13th meeting of 2025 of the Economy and the Fair Work Committee. Our first item of business is the fourth of our series of evidence sessions on Scotland's skills delivery and development landscape. The purpose of these sessions is to consider how the current skills system is working, identify the actions needed to support businesses and to improve the skills supply chain, including green skills. I'm delighted to welcome our panel this morning. First of all, Sandy Begbie, Chief Executive of Financial Enterprise Scotland. Paul Campbell, Employer Engagement Group Chair for the Scottish Apprenticeship Advisory Board. Jack Norcoy, Director of Public Affairs and Communications at Scottish Renewables. And Paul Sheeran, Chief Executive of Scottish Engineering. Welcome to our panel. As always, can I ask members and witnesses to keep questions and answers as concise as we possibly can. And to kick off the question, can I invite the Deputy Convener to ask her questions?
Good morning, panel. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I just wanted to ask a couple of open framing questions. As you know, this committee is looking at wider skills policy rather than the work that's underway in the Education Committee. But I just wanted to get a sense from your perspective as to how businesses engage with Scotland's skills system and to what extent you feel that the views of industry or your sector is fairly represented and heard in order to shape both policy and the provisioning of skills. So the first person who looks up, I will direct my... Jack, well done. I'm going to direct my question, but I'd like to hear from all of you in the panel on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Convener. Great to be here and really welcome the committee's time into what is a really key priority for Scotland's renewable energy industry and supply chain, but actually more broadly across the whole economy. And we certainly recognise within our industry our role within that economy, but also some of the pressures that are being felt across. And I think one of those pressures is most acutely skills shortages. As an industry, we are looking to invest and build at scale in Scotland, and that requires a kind of host of enablers. But one of those really key enablers is people, as a workforce, and we want to create a workforce for the future. Industry is stepping up to that challenge. We are investing at scale. Private sector investment within the skills system is around 4 billion per year. We can see that really actively within the members that I represent at Scottish Renewables in the formation of skills academies at some of Scotland's ports and STEM initiatives as well. Industry is willing to play our part, but we do hit the challenge when it comes to the public sector in terms of apprenticeships, in terms of our colleges as well, who are absolutely key at this. And I think a kind of overriding message that I want to get across today is on the one hand, we need to create an education and skills system which is more agile and more responsive to our economic priorities. And that's going to be really critical in the years ahead when we're looking to deploy projects which are actively in the pipeline today. So there is work we need to do to quite quickly reform that system. On the other hand, the thing that will benefit the development and delivery of skills in Scotland is the certainty that we can provide to some of those developments that will happen within our industry, but also across the economy as well. So certainty in the pipeline of projects that we have in Scotland is absolutely critical, because if we can get that sustained project activity across our pipeline, that is in itself going to create some of those complementary private sector investments that we need to make. So I think I absolutely recognise this as being one of the key barriers, but also fundamentally a key opportunity as well, and how we can create that workforce of the future.
Well, thank you very much for answering that. And you've skillfully taken the opportunity to put some of Scottish Renewables' interest on the record, and quite rightly so. But I still want to understand to what extent, from your perspective in terms of Scottish Renewables, and I'll come to everybody, you feel that the views of industry are heard to shape policy and provision.
Yeah, I think there is absolutely a need for the education and skills system to take into account the needs of industry better. There is, I think, frustrations in that regard in terms of how effectively we can input our needs into the system so that we can create, as I say, that kind of agile and responsive system, particularly in regard to colleges, and you can take a kind of a place-based approach to that. We have the benefit of we know where our pipeline is, we know the projects, we've got that strategic line of sight, so we can begin to work ourselves backward from that point in terms of what are the skills and the workforce requirements for those projects, and we can begin to look around the country as to kind of utilising the great network of colleges we have in Scotland to meet those projects. So I think overriding message there is an industry we feel that there should be a more effective way of inputting those needs.
And just to finish off on this, do you, I mean, you've mentioned providers in terms of colleges and so on, but do you feel that there's a clear line of sight for your trade body to be able to influence and shape policy? For example, the New Deal for Business. I mean, is it clear to you how you're able to do that policy shaping?
I think within the energy industry broadly, but I think in regard to what the committee's questioning today, it's a busy environment in terms of bodies and initiatives that operate in that space, and they all have a role to play. But I think there is a role for government to be able to kind of effectively pull that landscape together, so that they collaborate more, and to benefit, as you say, the kind of inputting of industry. So I think industry, as I said at the start, is stepping up to some of the frustrations that we can see, but we're going to hit some of those wider barriers. So wider collaboration, both at a Scottish and a UK level, is going to be really important.
Okay, so the same question to the rest of the panel. Perhaps you'd like to come in, Sandy. I think you were the next one that looked up. Thank you.
Much what's been said. So I would. I also wear another hat, by the way, just so everyone knows. I chair Developing Young Workforce. So I've got a couple of angles on this. I've always viewed this as it's a big supply and demand almost equation, and bluntly, the supply and the demand is not aligned at the moment, and the process in the middle. The words I've written down here around engaging with the process. It's hard, it's complex. Some of our firms give up, and it's just really difficult to navigate. And I think in the Withers Review, he calls out a lot of that. So engaging into the system is hard. That said, that's at a holistic level. You will also find some great examples at a micro level of either engaging directly with a college or directly with the universities. You'll find some really good examples of where some of our members have engaged directly with them. Barclays is a good example in Glasgow in terms of their campus and the way that they worked with Glasgow College and Cali and Strathclyde around helping them resource that campus. But the question in my mind is, the system doesn't allow that sort of model to be scaled, and I think that's part of the challenge. So I've written down here at a macro level. I think that the language in the report is, that the whole is, the whole is less than the sum of the parts, which I think is right. You asked about how our views are taken on board. About 2 years ago now, we did a significant piece of work where we engaged across our membership, across our industry. We're the largest industry in economic terms in Scotland, 10% of GVA, 15 billion. And we articulated what our skills would look like over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. And we sent out to all colleges and universities. And we got 10 replies. And that was it. And in fact, we even got a reply that said, thank you very much, but we don't really think we can help you with this. So, that's the kind of thing. But again, you will find at an individual level, I won't call any institutions out specifically, once you've got that traction, you can really make it work effectively for you. So you can get heard, but it tends to be at a individual firm and institution level rather than an overall macro level. I'd just like to pick up a point on agility, agile. A lot is written about impact of things like AI and other things. The head of technology at Lloyds Banking Group mentioned to me last week that they're now working on the basis that they need to retrain their tech people every 9 to 12 months. So how does the system respond to the world that we now live in, which is got far more pace in it in terms of developments, and particularly in that tech space. So hopefully, Michelle, that answers give you a round about engagement and then how views are heard.
Yeah, no, and it's a super answer, because without being aware, my very next question was going to be on your insights on how we deal with some of the major thematics, i.e. AI, and getting to net zero. So perhaps, given that you've introduced that topic, I'll give you a chance to come in as well, Jack, but either Paul, or in fact Paul Campbell, then Paul Sheeran perhaps, if you could reflect on all of this. But I think there is also the question about the exponential growth that will be triggered by AI and net zero, and the linkages therein that are quite complex when you look at. So it would also be useful. But the first question, first about engagement.
Yeah, so from an engagement perspective, Michelle, I think obviously chair the SAB Employer Engagement Group, so Scottish Apprenticeship Advisory Board. So from an apprenticeship perspective, I would say engagement is incredibly strong. So you have 80 senior business people involved in that structure. I think James Withers acknowledged that in the review as well. I think the OECD, when they have looked at it, have said, the progress that has been made from an apprenticeship perspective in terms of integrating business, industry, employers with apprentice demand, the structures that are required, has been quite remarkable, actually. So I think from an apprenticeship point of view, it is very, very strong. I think business perspective would be similar to what Sandy was saying. There is very high demand for vocational education, training, apprenticeships. Within the group that I chair, we look at that quite often on a kind of annual basis, and then we revisit it in terms of service and the demand from industry for apprenticeships. And we find that the demand far outstrips the supply and the availability of apprenticeships coming through the system, and that is in all facets. So I think the ability to engage is very strong from that perspective. I think to take your point on policy specifically, it's actually one of the things that SAB would say is probably lacking at the moment from a kind of Scotland perspective, as a coherent and integrated cross-party policy in relation to apprenticeships, in terms of what we have to do to fund vocational education and training, and how that aligns with priority needs and sectoral needs, and what we actually need to develop for the economy and for the workforce. So there is a bit of a mismatch in terms of the demand and what's required and what the system is producing, and there are systemic shortages that I'm sure everyone would talk about. Agility is something that, again, has come through in numerous reports. I think the world around us is changing, the world of work, AI, automation, the Internet of Things, everything is changing pretty rapidly. Our ability to respond to that has to be quite rapid as well. I would say the only way that you can do that is by having really strong integration and partnership between business, between government, between the skills bodies who are working on that. Get your demand, pretty accurate in terms of what you're trying to do, and then put the muscle behind it to actually deliver that. And I think at the moment that's the bit that kind of business wrestles with in terms of that kind of mismatch, because from a government perspective, we do invest a lot of money in education and skills, so there is a lot of kind of money goes into it. I think when we look at things like apprenticeships in particular, we know there is very strong alignment between the apprenticeship family, the provision that is there, and what it is designed to do. Anywhere between 92 and 95% of apprentices who complete an apprenticeship stay in occupations that are related to the apprenticeship that they have done. But in some other parts of the system, that's not always the case. So we have the highest rate of tertiary education in Europe, actually. So we have a fantastic rate of tertiary education. It's about 50.4% of people in Scotland are educated to a tertiary level, but there can be a mismatch between what people are qualified in and what business needs, and there are still shortages. There was some work done by the CIPD, which is my professional body, in 2022, which suggested that 34% of graduates who were surveyed would say they are not using the qualifications that they graduated in as part of what they do in their occupations. So again, from an apprenticeship point of view, very, very strong. There is the ability to influence that. I think SAB has made great strides in that, and it was acknowledged by James Withers in the report. And I think there is a bit of a kind of nervousness among the SAB employers at the moment that we could risk unpicking some of that by the proposed changes that are underway.
Thank you. Paul Sheehan.
Thanks very much. So to start with, what's the route for industry to ensure their voice is represented? So for the most part, I can talk about our membership. The largest companies have their own dedicated people who do that, but the vast majority of membership in Scottish Engineering, like the vast majority of industry, is SME based. They simply don't have the time for that, so they look to bodies like us to represent their views. And you'll know the many ways that we do that. I think there are routes to do that through industry leadership groups that we'll sit on, events like today and consultations, but predominantly most of those SMEs are not doing that themselves. They'll do it through us. Interesting enough, Paul Campbell talks about SAB. Up until today, they had a direct route to do that by being a member of the Scottish Apprenticeship Advisory Board. But I believe that comes to an end today. But it's another part of, I think, the current landscape for skills reform, which is unclear to industry. And that's a particularly sore one, I think, when you think about how effective that organisation has been for the skills landscape, particularly for work-based learning. In terms of what the industry think then about that, so again, because most of that channels through us, we get to stand up and give their input on it, and also watch and see what comes back. And I think today they would say that their views might be heard, but they're not being listened to, and they're certainly not being acted on. From all of the feedback, consultation that we've put in since the start of this skills review back at the Withers report, I don't think I can point to any one thing where there's been an action which has reflected the input from industry. And that's a great cause of frustration. And I think where we stand just now is that we're in a place where it feels like there is no evidence that the interim activity in this area has built confidence that we're on the right track for this situation.
And just to pick up on that, just for the record, because it's also always useful to furnish with an example, is there an example you're able to give us today, just so that we can reflect that in our deliberations?
Scottish Engineering represents these views principally through our quarterly reports. Every quarter we do a survey of our membership. We ask particular questions. We always have a floating question where we can ask something particular. Last year we undertook a piece of work which we thought was essential to explaining the need for change in the direction from a skills point of view. And we undertook a skills survey for the skills gap for engineering and manufacturing in Scotland. The result of that was chastening at best. What we saw from that is that if you look at the requirement in predominantly work-based learning, so modern apprentice type output roles, we need 58% more across these 31 key roles by the end of 2027 than what we have today, just to replace the expected retirees and the expected growth in demand from various things of growth in business. And the thing to remember about that nearly 60% is just for incumbent industry. It includes none of the opportunity for Scotland in offshore wind, in hydrogen, in grid infrastructure renewal, in decarbonising heat. So all of the things which talk to our ambitions to reach net zero, they're not in that 60%. And worse than that, if you look at the intent for the long tail of SMEs and industry in general to train for that demand, more than half the roles, the intent to train was less than 50% of the number that they needed. So we have a huge gap, and we believe that evidence was sufficient to change tack on where we're going in terms of skills reform. and there has been no change since.
Thank you very much. Jack, I said I'd give you the last chance because we kind of moved on to talking about AI, and obviously net zero is your bag, but if you wanted to add any
That's fine.
final
I'll
reflections.
be brief. I think your question highlighted the growth of net zero, and that's absolutely what we can see. We've, as an industry, very much kind of got our eyes set on 2030, but crucially beyond 2030 as well. A lot of the pipeline in Scotland will come after that. But there is a kind of an immediate pressure there, and I think touching on what's been said, you can see the pressure at both sides in terms of an ageing population and workforce was highlighted, so the kind of demand to replace some of those roles that'll be leaving the workforce. You've got kind of the transferability issues between sectors as well, which industry is trying to respond to through the design of portals that will advertise some of these roles, skills passporting as well, for example. But then at the other side, you've got the need to actually attract young people, crucially, into these roles. And we know from analysis that's been made, around 87% of 16 to 24-year-olds don't know what skills they would need to access opportunities in net zero. So there's barriers right across the full spectrum of that workforce that we have to tackle quite quickly.
Yeah. And I think, Paul Sheeran, you just wanted a final comment before I hand back to the...
I forgot to pick up something on the net zero question. I think it's a good one. That requirement for foresighting to the areas like AI and other digital technologies is important, but I get a little bit cautious about it. We get cautious about it. We think, green skills, sustainable skills are just good skills that have digital skills within them, meta skills for good communication to go faster and achieve that, and also understand that the climate emergency is real and someone, us, needs to do something about it. But I think where worry is that in order to be a good automatic robotic welder, you need to be a good welder to start with. And that's probably 80 or 90% of what we do now in terms of training people to be a welder. And the same applies for an electronic technician, for an electrical fitter. So these are the skills, or the, to Sandy's point, every 12, 10 months, we're going to be changing at a pace where they need to be added. But they have to start from that baseboard of 80, 90%. And that's the bit we're failing to do just now. We are not filling the pipeline with the work-based learning skills that will look after us in terms of the economic opportunity for Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Michelle, can I bring in Kevin Stewart on a brief supplementary?
Just a very brief supplementary, Convener, picking up on the point that Jack made around about informing young folk of the skills that they require at an early stage. But I would go further than that and say enthusing young people to look at careers that they may not have thought about previously. I was speaking to another organisation this week who were suggesting that government, that politicians need to do more in terms of getting those messages across to young folk. I think politicians, government are the last folk that should try and entice young folk at an early age into particular career paths. But can I ask you, and we asked panels this last week, do you think that in terms of the folk that you represent, yourselves, that we're in schools early enough? I think we leave it too late and wait till secondary school when folks have already made up their minds, often picked subjects which didn't include the ones that would be required to get into engineering, for example. Do you think there should be more access into primary schools? And how would you enthuse young folk into seeking to enter the professions that you are representing here today? Jack, first, since I mentioned you, please.
Absolutely, I agree with that, and I think to put that into context on why we need to do it, there's the immediate pressure of the workforce that we're going to need for the projects in the years ahead, particularly up to 2030, are already employed, they're already in the workforce. But in terms of looking ahead to the workforce that we're going to need for developments beyond 2030 and into the 2040s, as you say, they're in primary school now, they're in secondary school now. So I absolutely agree there's a need to be enthusiastic about that, to attract them into this industry. Our members do that. Our members do really active engagement with communities through both just promotion of projects, but as I mentioned, Ocean Winds, for example, has done STEM programmes in the northeast of Scotland, where some of their operations and maintenance bases are. But I think the thing that will be helpful to kind of grasp onto that is the exciting opportunities that lie ahead there, but also that really clear visibility of what occupations it is we're going to need, and they cover a wide spectrum. But the skills that are most in demand for our sector at this time is construction, high voltage engineers, welders, and project managers. But there's far more to a project than the construction. There's operations and maintenance. There's the legal services that come into it as well. So how can we get people to pivot into our sector, perhaps from other sectors? And I think on that note as well, would recognise and appreciate this will be something that the committee will have to deliberate, is that some of these skills pools are in demand across sectors of the economy. So automation, aviation, house building, they're all looking for these skills as well. So again, it comes back to the point of needing to get more people into the system.
Paul Sheeran, please.
I'm not sure I agree that we need more people in the system. If we look at, so last year we surveyed on the ratio of demand or number of applications to number of places, and across the board it was roughly 50 to 1. So 50 applications for every one apprenticeship place that was available. So we have no problem with a volume. What we do have is a problem with the balance within that. We would like a better gender balance. We'd like any better measure of diversity within it. But what I can say is I see industry working hard to address that. Yes, being in schools earlier, programmes like primary engineering, I think it has to be primary school. I think it's too late by secondary school. Do a great job to address that. But what I would say, on top of that is while we are doing that, and we are making mild gains, not the ones we want, but to address those measures of diversity. Across the UK, critical skills, and let's pick welders, because we always pick welders. Across the UK, there are huge projects with huge numbers of foreign workers who are here working. There will be no gender diversity at all in that group. That is a missed opportunity for Scotland and the UK and to have good, well-paid, sometimes very well-paid jobs. But to do so, we need to do something fundamental about the choices of where we spend, what funds we have available for skills, to put more priority to work-based learning to fill that pipeline.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because you can have as much money as you want and throw it at various things. That it doesn't necessarily mean change. But what can mean change in terms of making folks think differently is seeing people like themselves aspire in particular careers. So let's look at women in engineering, women welders, as you've just said. From my perspective, the best way to inspire a young woman is to actually hear from a young woman who's doing that. Do we have enough ambassadors out there promoting these careers and try to persuade others that it's the right path for them?
I believe we do. I believe we do, and as I said, I mentioned programmes like Primary Engineer who bring ambassadors into primary schools to do just that. But your biggest challenge, and I do think also that the tide is turning with parents and grandparents who, up until recently, would say that the only sort of best path would be to a university education. I think that that's a changing picture financially. I think we have something to overcome with schools in terms of the perception, of what is a positive destination. I know we have an example of a really strong group training association who do apprentices, who wrote to all their schools in their area asking them to come to the open day and bring pupils with them. On the day, they had none. They had one who said they were going to come on the day, but in fact, at the last minute, those schools pupils were compelled to stay in school and carry on studying towards exams. I think we have a challenge in that respect, but you're absolutely right. There's no magic money trees, but right now we are not funding the demand for apprenticeships. So for the gains we make, in terms of better diversity of gender or any other measure, then a good starting point would be to fund the demand, and some of those 50-to-1 ratio would get the well-paid career path that they want to have. And we're not doing that just now. And that comes down to tough choices. Can't magic up money from somewhere else, but we need to choose more wisely how we spend the money we've got.
Paul Campbell, please.
Yeah. So I think it's a great point, and I would echo the comments of Jack. It's super important to get in early and try and work with young people and influence their perspective in terms of careers. Quite often we don't actually know the jobs that are going to be there for young people in primary school, but we know we need to develop meta skills and skills that can help them blossom in whatever they choose to do, which was Paul's point earlier. I think there was actually some fantastic work done on this on the back of the Wood Commission, and Sandy can probably speak to this better than me, but I was involved in DYW, developing young workforce groups for quite a number of years. And the Wood Commission recommended schools and business partnerships and close integration between business and schools and education to really inform and educate young people about opportunities and the kind of choices and chances that they might have. Personally, having been involved in that, and not so much from a SAB perspective, but from an organisational perspective with Scottish Water, who I work for, we found that working in secondary schools in particular, when you had a partnership, so not just popping in at a point in time, someone doing a presentation, talking about careers and jobs, quite often young people can't respond to that or relate to that, but actually getting in and spending time with young people, working with the headmaster in the school to understand what the school's challenges are, what the unique kind of challenges they've got might be, how you could support that as a business. And then getting your employees, quite often apprentices and graduates who are relatively young themselves, certainly by comparison to me, to go into the schools. And going in like second year and working closely in science and engineering and educating people about the opportunities that are available, and young women in particular, can really change the perspectives and their view of choices in terms of subjects that they might take. When we did some research on that ourselves and some of the work we were doing at St Andrews Secondary School in Glasgow at the time, and having our young female scientists go in to work with them over time in a sustained way, we found that 40% of young women said they now had a different view of the career opportunities they might have. They were now, they're going to choose science subjects that they hadn't considered before. And some of the comments were things like, we now know that women can do a man's job. So really getting in early and doing that. I know it sounds terrible, but that's genuine feedback that people were saying at the time. And I know the way that sounds, but that was the perspective of young women who had came through that. So absolutely agree with you. I think we lost some of that during COVID.
Yeah.
So that whole COVID period really interrupted that. The fact that a lot of workplaces still don't have people going back into offices just now can make some of that a bit more challenging from the point of view of experience for young people as well. So there's a bit about going into schools, but there's a bit about schools working with business. I think slightly later in the stage of a young person's experience during school, foundation apprenticeships in particular, if we were investing in them, create a real opportunity for young people to enter into the world of work and to look at really good career options and career choices. Unfortunately, at the moment, in terms of what's actually happening with availability and opportunities for foundation apprenticeships, the kind of target, if you like, or the typical amount of foundation apprenticeships that were being supported was about 5,000. It's actually reduced to about 4,500 at the moment. So there's kind of less opportunities coming through for that just now, which again is a bit concerning.
Sandy, please.
I agree with a lot of what's been said. I'll go back to my earlier point, which is I think the understanding and demand going out 5 years at least across key sectors, I think then can feed into I think proper career advice. I think when I did the work on the Young Person's Guarantee, and James calls out in his report, I think being kind, the word patchy is probably the best way to describe it. So there's no connection between what the economy will need in the future and the type of well-paid jobs, skilled jobs, and the fact is that apprenticeships play a big part in that. So I think I've written down again, I think it's a consistent theme, whether it's through my role with DYW, you could look at every region across DYW and you will find that we've got great relationships with schools, and you could be in the same region and the school doesn't engage at all. So there's a huge variation in terms of consistency.
Scenario. It depends on the people in the schools as well.
Head teacher has a huge impact.
Last week, yeah.
In terms of what we do, in, specifically in financial services, we have a young persons network which is almost 1,000 strong, sort of 17 to 30-year-olds, and over the last 12 months they've now been going into schools and running sessions. So to your point, there's no point in having people who have been in the industry 20, 30 years going in to speak to 13 or 14-year-olds or 15-year-olds. They're much better hearing from a 17 or 18-year-old who's maybe a year in, has come through the apprenticeship route, etc. And it legitimises a lot of what, or it starts to change perceptions around apprenticeships, and people start to realise you can't go to a Morgan Stanley or an EY. You can go straight from school. You can work for 4 or 5 years. You can still get your qualification, and actually you've got 5 years of work under your belt. And so getting people like that into schools, I'm not saying it's an either or. University education clearly is really important, and that's all. But I think we've kind of lost a sense of a bit of a sense of balance. Mentioned about parents. I think that's a key factor in that as well. I think the other thing as well, which we haven't quite touched on, but I think is important given the government's agenda, is that employment and well-paid employment will, over the long run, have a significant impact on the poverty levels that we experience in this country. There are too many young people who just don't think that they've got a path.
Yeah.
And I think that we've heard the demands across here. I can add in here over 3 years, we reckon financial services needs about between 40 and 50,000 roles replaced in that time. If you went around all the sectors and added it up, I've no data on this, but we could be almost at full employment if we really challenged ourselves, because some of the investment that's going in, it's a system that's not connecting all these components together that I think businesses find particularly frustrating.
Okay. Very briefly, convener, because I asked this question last week. I know. In terms of we've heard that where the right people are there is that big linkage between schools and an industry which works well for all, but particularly the young folk. Sandy, you said that there are places where the people are just not interested. Is it time for us to mandate schools to ensure that industry can get in to speak to people?
I think
very briefly.
So I think it's about mandate. If you look at countries that do this well, I think there's clarity on the economic strategy in the long run. What are the key sectors and what are the key skills that the country is going to need over the next 5 or 10 years? I think if you've got that framework, then you would like to think the majority of people would then respond positively to that and able to transfer that information to young people to make informed judgments. You're always going to have some outliers, but you'd like to think if you had that clarity, then a lot of them would fall into line. If some don't, then I think it's up to government to make sure that that happens. But I think because of some of that lack of clarity, then I don't think that helps in terms of that. So I think that direction, I think, is hugely important, and it's not what we have at the moment.
Paul?
I think at a very practical level, again, from an experiential point of view, where there are coordinators in school who are dedicated to that, developing the young workforce and have that role, it tends to work well. When there isn't, less so. I think the more government could do from a policy perspective to influence that, the better. Taking Sandy's point about demand, again, we know from looking at the best performing systems across Europe and OECD, about 70% of young people in school in Switzerland go through vocational education and training routes. So a vast amount more young people going through that route, and that's to do with the connectivity between business, demand, the economy, what's required, and the system and how it works.
I don't think mandating that is necessary, particularly when we have such systemic challenges that we're discussing today. But I think it is incumbent on industry to be that good neighbour, essentially, in terms of building that grassroots connections, and that requires a bit of capacity building at that local level. But I just really want to echo the point that Sandy made around that economic strategy helping to drive this forward as well. And I think a really key message of our industry is that we want to secure these employment opportunities, but to get the employment, we need the deployment of projects. And at this moment in time, we are concerned about the risk to the pipeline that we have in Scotland.
I would characterise industry as saying yes, if they're directly asked the question, and then it needs to be made easy for them. So even the most busiest of underwater SMEs will try to say yes. And I think that's where the role of DYW steps in. I think the bit to help there is that these programmes work best when they are long-sighted. So the examples that I've heard of DYW are we being refunded, will there be the place for the DYW coordinator in the school? I think you get out of that cycle because I think it brings uncertainty and I think it pulls the programme back. But you have to make it easy. Industry will say yes as long as there's a coordinator there who makes it easy for them to say yes.
Okay, can I bring in Lorna Slater?
Thank you. I have a few different questions, if the convener will indulge me. I'll start on the point around careers advice, which we've just been covering in a bit. I'll move on to the sort of flexibility of the system, and then I'll close on apprenticeships, because I know some of my colleagues have the questions there. We've just been touching on, I think, some of the solutions to the joining up problem that Sandy highlighted. We have this enormous potential and need for skills opportunities in Scotland, but both young people and sort of mid-career transitioners are not finding those, are not aware of those. And I certainly remember when I was a young STEM ambassador, so I'm an electromechanical engineer. In my younger days, I did go into schools to try and talk to kids about engineering, and I would show them pictures of the work we were doing, and it was so far removed, especially in more deprived areas, from their experience. So these were kids who had aspirations to be dog walkers. They couldn't imagine themselves operating machinery, let alone designing it. And so there is some sort of midway gap between you need a master's degree in engineering and you can be a dog walker, which we don't seem to be filling. One of the criticisms I've heard frequently is around the careers advice, and I think Sandy said that it's patchy, and Paul is being saying the DYP coordinators are not there. Is that the missing piece of the puzzle? How important is that?
I think, given DYW, I think taking the school coordinator role, and I said this to James, taking the school coordinator role and the SDS career advisor and putting them together into one role, every secondary school should have one person whose role is to connect with industry and bring that advice to young people. Obviously, smaller schools you might cover, but in the principle is that there is one person in school who is responsible and whose job it is to do it. And where you have someone whose job is a job, you can see the outcomes are quite significant. I went back to my old secondary school, Musselbridge, a few weeks ago, and they've got a great DYW coordinator, and they're bringing employers in all the time and talking to young people, and apprenticeships are just standard language that they talk about, etc. So I think making sure the system inside the schools, and I think to your point, Lorna, is, but we need to provide those coordinators or career advisors with the information. And three things that we've tried to do in our industry. One is to explain it. So we try and do three things as a trade body. One is explain our industry to young people in language that makes sense for them. So we go out and ask them what they think about our industry. Some of it's not always pleasant, so we need to respond to that. Secondly is the skills that we need in the future, because they tend to have a perception of what the industry is and the skills that they might need. They certainly don't really associate our industry with data and AI, for example. We're quite low down the priority when actually there is. And then the third thing is pathways. So even if you get a young person interested and they're interested in a particular area of the skills, it's deeply confusing as to where do I go, what do I do, what's the college courses, university, etc. And I think having someone in school to help them understand industry skills and pathways, I think makes a lot of sense as a framework in schools.
I don't know if anyone else wanted to come in on that.
Yeah,
please.
So I certainly think there has to be something done that changes that mindset more generally in schools. And so the example I give, recently we had an event for Scottish National Apprenticeship Week. We had our Graduate Apprentice of the Year winner from last year. We had a runner-up in the Modern Apprentice and another Modern Apprentice there. All three of them spoke eloquently, were really engaging, but when it came to the question from the audience was how much encouragement did you get from your school to take up an apprenticeship role, the answer was we were discouraged. We were discouraged. Wow. We were encouraged, no, you're smart enough to go to university. That's where you should be going. One of them actually went to university, did 2 years in a degree that they found miserable before coming out and taking up an engineering apprenticeship. I think something has to be, what's the answer there? Well, I don't know about you, my heart sinks every time I see another league table that talks about, this many, people going to university. If it was me, if I had a magic wand, I would have a multiplier for everyone who goes to an apprenticeship, who therefore is entering the workplace, contributing in tax and national insurance, has money to spend in the economy. There should be a 2 for 1. They keep this league table, but multiply it by 2.
Yeah. Okay. I won't make everyone come in on every question if they don't have anything to add, but unless there's something keen to add.
I do decide that, there is a real shortage of electrical mechanical engineers as well. Lorna.
Well, I hear Jack's looking for project managers. I'll pop my CV through. In one of the frustrations we've been hearing is from employers is about inflexibility in Scotland's skills system, particularly around the colleges, where college courses are only offered during certain times of the year. Colleges are not able to keep up with the technology. Lothian buses, for example, use private training providers because the colleges don't have hydrogen buses for the apprentices in that case to practice on. How can we make our college and indeed university sectors flexible enough to provide the workforce that we desperately need? Any thought? Paul? Paul, 2 Pauls. Paul Campbell.
I think at the risk of kind of repeating the same thing, it is around about being really clear on the demand that industry needs and the economy needs, and helping our institutions, shape themselves in such a way that they can deliver that. And at the moment, that's a kind of missing link just now. So it's kind of repeating the same thing, if you like, but taking the point about even going back to careers advice. There's a bit of a kind of chicken and egg scenario. You almost can't promote apprenticeships as much as you would like to, because there isn't a sufficient number of them for young people to go into. So when you speak to people in SAB, typically some employers will get about 150 young people applying for one apprenticeship position. You look at Scottish Power, SSE, the big organisations, there is a massive demand for it. So I think it's all about that supply-demand piece, getting that right, having your college infrastructure set up in such a way that it can deliver it, and real good alignment between your kind of HE and FE to make sure it's kind of meeting those demands.
Paul?
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's important there's always room for improvement. But in terms of that, if you were to talk to industry today about are they happy with the general provision for apprenticeship training, they would say yes. And so it's not the burning building. Absolutely, there are companies who say, well, I choose to have a stronger balance of my training coming from, for instance, group training associations. And I think they've done pretty poorly out of the way that the funding model works just now. But, in general, that tends to be an employer choice. And I would say broadly, they're happy with the provision of training they get. There is an opportunity. The upskilling and reskilling, we have chunks of time when the college, if you had a college sat in front of us today, I'm sure the first thing they would say was, we'd love to do that, but we are literally scraping 2 halfpennies together to get by just now. So finding models that are flexible to do that in the downtimes in between the terms, I'm sure college would say absolutely, all those things are possible, but not from the funding landscape that we have just now. Stuff like that.
Something that I'm interested in, kind of on that theme, is around workplace learning. Something that I'm continually surprised and slightly horrified by is how far the UK is behind North America on things like co-oping and engineering programs. And I don't know how familiar you are with those things. When I studied engineering at my university, and it was common for universities all over North America, my degree took 5 years, but it took me 7 years to graduate, because 2.5 of those years I worked in industry, paid by industry and not at minimum wage either, at junior engineering rates, to do work, such that when I graduated, not only had I had some impact on my student loans, when I graduated I had 2.5 years of experience, and I was able to walk into, I was offered 2 jobs in my first week of being in the UK. The model there is that universities partner with industry. Industry knows this exists, and you get students for a chunk of time, 4 months, 8 months, or a year. So those engineering students are able to complete an entire project. And it's quite common for engineering companies to go, oh, brilliant, we need a new thing. Oh, we'll get some co-op students in the summer to deliver that project for us. So it's a long-term partnership. And it means that we're not juggling the difficulty that we're having with the graduate apprentices, where you're sort of 3 days a week here, 3 days a week there, which is difficult for funding lecturers. It's difficult for students, in terms of planning their life and transport to work and all those sort of ordinary logistics. In terms of flexibility of institutions, is that North American model being looked at all? Do you think it should? Is it not right for the UK? How do we get this workplace learning better here?
It was interesting, when you mentioned that, Lorna, because I was actually going to refer to graduate apprenticeships as being part of the solution to that, because that is learning in work and through work. It is close integration between the universities and the institutions, employers and what they need, and the graduate is learning off-site in university, but also on-site and doing projects in the workplace. So I think from a business perspective, and certainly our perspective of graduate apprenticeships has been extremely positive as a way to do that. There is probably things you could do to improve it structurally in terms of how they're designed and the time in work.
And who funds those? Who pays the students' wages?
So the employer pays the wages. So
okay.
Going back to Paul's point, so at the moment there's only about 1,378 graduate apprenticeships that are funded just now. SAB would argue, and they have done research on this, that you could probably take about 4,500 to 5,000. When those graduate apprenticeships are going through their apprenticeship with university, they are working, they are paying tax, they are paying national insurance. Chances are they won't be incurring any student debt. Quite often a graduate apprentice will be earning maybe 25,000 from day one, so it's well-paid jobs. They are well in advance of a normal graduate in our experience, because they have been integrated into work. They have learned, their speed to productivity, their contribution is faster. And I was actually thinking about this last night in advance of the committee, from the whole kind of student loan perspective, which obviously money goes into that as well. From what I could see, typically the kind of average student debt for a young person coming through in Scotland might be about £14,000. Now that's lower than it is in the UK, which is a good thing. But if we had 5,000 graduate apprentices who weren't incurring any student debt, that's equivalent to about £70 million of efficiency in the system. So it is a much more efficient way of doing it. And I think, again, when SAP have looked at that and we talk about it, it's often, I suppose, interpreted as saying we need more money. I think we're very, very aware of the fiscal challenges that exist. But we do believe there are other parts of the system which are not closely integrated with the needs of business, where substitution could take place. And there could be a much better alignment with that. Sandwich degrees, as they may have been called, or year in industry, do still happen to some extent, so they do still happen. It's not the norm. But I personally think graduate apprenticeships are the way to do that.
Any other thoughts on... Yeah.
So I'm going to echo that, and I think that we used to do an awful lot more of sandwich degrees, and I think that's a reflection of across, and I think it's a UK-wide problem, so where our skills system used to be centred around a much stronger mix of large companies with large training academies and schools. And so I think that effect of the long tail of SMEs and making up more than 90% of industry is a change for that. I think we have to accept we are where we are. I think graduate apprentices, what we've heard from companies, the companies who've done them say they are absolutely the answer. Right. And the barrier to entry is they look at it and say, gosh, that's, £130,000, £150,000 of investment before I start getting anything back. And then they do one and they realise that because it's work-based learning, where actual work projects within the workplace are used as evidence of learning, they see that actually I'm getting useful work out much earlier, and at the end of it I'm actually getting the person I need. Plus we also have someone who's literally already in employment, and that continues on, so we have none of that leakage that we elsewhere get in engineering graduates, where we lose to other sectors, and sometimes we lose just because they actually struggle to get employment within engineering because they haven't picked up experience while they've been an undergraduate. We need to do more. I think we're at that struggle where graduate apprentices have been flatlined, so we've not got the economy of scales within the university institutions where, as you build the programme, things get slicker, things get, it becomes more the norm. That would be our route.
Thank you very much. I'll hand back to the, sorry, unless Jack wanted to come in. No, I'll hand back to the convener. I'll let other members pick up the apprentices point.
Feel free to come back in, but I'll bring in Murdo Fraser at this point.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. Can I just pick up on Lorna Slater's point about graduate apprenticeships, because I think this is a very interesting model, and we've talked quite a lot about this in the committee. And it seems that the opportunity for graduate apprenticeships and all the advantages from that is not being matched by the supply. So where is the barrier to this happening? Is it in the institutions? Because anecdotally, I've heard that some of the universities are not very keen on graduate apprenticeships because they prefer a model where you just have full-time students coming in and there are funding issues. But Paul, you're nodding, so I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think there are a number of challenges, Murdo. I think from the institution's perspective, they may feel that financially for them, graduate apprenticeships doesn't offer the same benefits as a traditional route, where there's maybe one to the many and it's quite a high kind of ratio of kind of lecturer and student contact time. I think ultimately it does come back to the demand question, and I mentioned it earlier at the start. We know through research that about 34% of people who are graduating from university at the moment are actually saying they're not using their degrees, so there is that misalignment. There is amazing appetite amongst employers to take more graduate apprenticeships. There is demand there. And I think there is a question, so from an SFC perspective, how much ability SFC actually have, going back to the question about mandating things, to actually mandate that institutions do more graduate apprenticeships and align them with the sector needs, and the business and economy's needs. So something has to happen in terms of really mandating the labour demand, the economic demands, the sectors that need graduate apprenticeships. I think there's 14 graduate apprenticeships at the moment. All of them are really well aligned with economic needs. It's the things we've been speaking about today. It's software development, it's cyber security, it's engineering, it's accountancy, it's business management. They're very well aligned with what business need. There's just not enough of them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Anybody else got a thought on what the barriers are?
Only to agree with what Paul has said.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Let me ask a slightly different question, which is around funding for apprenticeship places, because this is an issue we've heard a lot about in evidence. And we heard, I think, Score Group, who were in last week, raised this specifically with us around the apprenticeship levy. And there's frustration. Many Scottish businesses feel that they are paying the apprenticeship levy money, but they don't see the transparency as to where that money goes. And particularly for businesses that operate across the UK, what they're telling us is there's more transparency south of the border in terms of the apprenticeship levy money coming back, and also the amount of money that they get per apprentice is much higher down south than it is in Scotland. So I'd be interested to get any perspectives you have on that. Paul, you're nodding, so I'll start with you.
Yeah, so they hear this exact same thing, that lack of transparency, and then they ask us, well, what is it? We try and add it up and say, well, we think roughly a third of the apprenticeship levy take from Scotland that comes back gets spent on apprenticeships. When we say that, we're told, well, it's not that, but we don't get the answer as to what it actually is. So that'd be a good start. I think we'll be careful with the too big a comparison with what's going on in England, because that same levy and the way it's administered, yes, they do get more, and certainly the training providers would say they get almost 3 times as much. But it's also been the key part of a 40% fall in apprenticeships in England as well. So we need, when we think about solutions, we need to be careful we don't follow paths that do more harm to the patient than good.
No, I was just going to echo what Paul said there in terms of our industry. We've heard that message as well in terms of the members that we represent in Scottish Renewables, in that the lack of transparency being frustrating, but also the lack of flexibility for employers within that as well. And just put into some context, with the development of a new growth and skills levy, I think we need to really hear some of those insights from industry carefully in the development of that, but also showing that kind of better consistency of support as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of just repeating the same thing, I think employers invariably would like to see more transparency in terms of the levy and how it's utilised. I think certainly the last time I saw anything on the levy was around about 2019. And at that point in time, there was 239 million, I think, being returned as part of the levy from the UK to Scotland. That was used in a range of different things, employability funds, some of it supported DYW, some of it was for apprenticeships, so it was used in different ways. But I think the overwhelming feedback that we consistently hear from business is that it would be nice to understand what that is and have some transparency about how it's actually utilised and spent.
Okay, thanks. That's very helpful. On the kind of broader issue around funding, I mean, you've all talked about experiences where apprenticeships are advertised and the number of applicants well outweighs the number of places.
Yeah.
So what is the barrier to offering more apprenticeship places from an industry point of view? Maybe Paul, I'll ask you that. Is it primarily around funding, or is it a lack of capacity in terms of employers, or a lack of opportunities further down the track? So employers are not taking on people to do apprenticeships unless they see a future career path.
So the starting point is, as I said previously, we believe from a survey we did last year that 1 in 5 times where an employer went to their college or their group training association and said, I want to do an apprentice, they said, I'm sorry, the funding's all done. So that's a first starting point for that. Beyond that, I think, again, you have to take cognizance of this different split we have in the sizes of companies, and it's something that's changed in the last 2-3 decades. And so larger companies tend to be in programmes where there are frameworks and long-sightedness, where they can plan today for something that's coming in 7 years or 6 years or 5 years' time. An SME will invest today in something that they have a line of sight to the purchase order that will pay for that investment. And when they are living on contracts from 3 months and 6 months or even a year, an apprentice is at least a 4-year investment, more likely 5.5 in some cases. They just don't have the long-sightedness to be operating at the levels we need them to be in order to fill that need.
I think another point, sorry, if it's okay, just in terms of the kind of funding element, is to emphasise that is a contribution. Employers are still putting in the vast majority of the contribution. Yeah. So broadly speaking, for every £1 that goes in funding, employers probably put about £10. So funding and capacity is an issue, I think, from a training provider and a college perspective. If they don't have the funding, they won't deliver the places. Slightly different for employers, perhaps, who run their own academies and operate as training providers. They'd be tempted to take more. But I think capacity and funding does block the system to an extent. I mean, last year, Murdo, we had 25,500 starts for modern apprenticeships. Pre-COVID, we were well on our way to 30,000. So it's actually going down the way, unfortunately. Again, from the kind of interactions we have within SAB, there is easily demand for more than that. Training providers, I think last year, had ambitions to take about 35,000. So in terms of what the training providers would be saying they would like to take. So quite often what happens is it's not demand-led from the perspective of here is the demand, how do we service that need? Here is the demand, how do we fit those needs as best as possible into the available funding that's there, which is very different.
Okay, one last question. I'm sorry, Jack, I know you've not answered that, but maybe you can come in on this as well. Scottish Government are looking at moving apprenticeship funding from Skills Development Scotland into the Scottish Funding Council. In your view, is that going to be a help or a hindrance in terms of supporting apprenticeships going forward? Paul.
I'll go first. I don't think it's the right solution. Industry doesn't think it's the right solution. Why is that? Well, we accept that there always has to be, we always have to look for efficiencies. So the idea of combining organisations makes sense from that point of view. However, what we see from that is if you want to be directly connected to the opportunity for the economy, then you need to be industry facing. And so the body that it does that and does it really well is Skills Development Scotland. So to go the other way, to take the larger organisation and cram it into the smaller organisation, and by doing so dismantling the industry-facing bit, makes no sense. I think the other thing that industry says to us, and I'll quote directly, they say, everything that we see in terms of the skills reform process is fiddling while Rome burns. We are in a situation of crisis in skills, and there is nothing we see within the skills reform which will do something to help that. And, and I think, I used an analogy earlier on about patience. This is a situation where it's almost like you're looking at somebody in front of you who has life-threatening injuries, and the answer is what we need to do first is build a hospital. And then when you go build a hospital, you build the wrong one.
Okay, thank you.
Entirely agree. I think it's recognise the point that's been made in terms of, been going through some of the issues today, some of the real systemic issues that we have, and the reform in front of us is not being as responsive as we need it to be. And I think the themes that we've discussed and previously into the exchange about getting that, sustainable funding models is really important. Giving that multi-year certainty as well is going to be really important as part of that. I think a bit of kind of recognising the contribution that industry is making as well, bringing that in would be really helpful in terms of what Paul says about being industry facing. And it is just, need to get to a place where we are going to be far more responsive. And I think we are concerned about the kind of real pressure that we're going to hit very quickly.
Yeah, I think from a SAB perspective, the view would be that that has a lot of inherent risk within it. And even when you look at the financial memorandum for structural reform and that move towards SFC, it suggests there's about a 9.1 million efficiency over 4 years related to apprenticeships from that change. I think that makes employers nervous, because of what they've experienced so far from an apprenticeship perspective, which is the funding that's there just now isn't meeting demand. If that reduces further still, that might cause additional issues. So I think it's inherently risky. To take Paul's point, experience would be that actually SDS are pretty good at that. They have very good articulation in terms of demand. The employer engagement group, which I chair, will regularly look at numbers, statistics, demand for apprenticeships, where investment is going, how that, from an agile point of view, where do we have to re-divert and use places that haven't been used. And we seem to be moving it the other way, potentially reinforcing parts of the system where that alignment isn't as strong. So I think it is inherently risky, and I think what the evidence over the last few years has kind of told us is that when you look at things like foundation apprenticeships in colleges, the numbers have reduced, so they've gone down the way. When you look at things like graduate apprenticeships, they have stayed the same. They are not increasing to meet demand. So moving funding in that direction, I think SAB would view as being quite a risky thing to do.
Sandy.
First of all, I'd just like to apologise, convener. I was expecting a call from my GP, so I had to go and take it, and she may call me back before the end of the meeting. Apologise. I'd just like to, and she just does. Can I take that call? I'm waiting on an urgent appointment, so my apologies.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you all. Yeah.
Much more. Can I bring in Daniel Johnson?
I'd just like to follow on. Because obviously we're not sitting here looking at the skill system with a blank sheet of paper. There is an active proposal from the government. And I think, Jack, Norca, you earlier on said that we need the system to be responsive. That seems to me that we need industry and employers to be engaged up front. So we are removing SAB, which was one point where we had industry engagement. We also then had the SDS board, which had industry membership on it. Does the panel understand where the voice of industry and the government's proposals that in the bill are, and what do the panel think parliamentarians' response to that bill should be on the basis of kind of that industry voice? Paul, can I maybe come to you first?
I'll start. So I've been quite clear in my view. I don't think we're on the right path at all, and I think the damage to the economic benefit for Scotland is the result of that. More specifically, to pick up those points, I think we are. Well, I mentioned earlier on, today is the last day of SAB. I'm a member of the SAB Employer Engagement Group. I have no idea what's coming next. I have no idea what's in the interim. I have no idea what fills in and what will replace it. And our apprenticeship system in Scotland is a live system that needs constant maintenance and care and input to make sure that it's on the right track. So I think that's an example of the lack of... So you can say at one level, yes, fundamentally, my membership disagree with the route we've gone, and that's the outcome or the target outcome. But if you look at the process, the lack of transparency, the lack of clarity on what this is, the timescales, what there has been. I read the financial memorandum, but this is a big task. Anybody who's been through an acquisition and merger before knows that those are tough jobs to do. And my worry has been from the start that while we have a skills crisis, all of our energy will be going into what it takes to merge those two organisations together, to overcome all of the difficulties, to go through the culture change that will have to happen. I'm worried too that along the way we will lose people, because what we saw during COVID was people say, I have choices, and they say, I will step out of industry, maybe retire. And so the timing couldn't be worse for Scotland. The opportunity to lose knowledge, skills, understanding and passion for the kind of work-based learning which will bring the economic opportunity that Scotland wants, for us is the wrong place, wrong time.
So the renewable sector probably is the sector that is facing the biggest change, needs the biggest increase in skills. Does Scottish Renewables have clarity on where kind of the industry voice will exist within the proposed new system?
We don't have clarity, no. And I think we are kind of looking at it, obviously we are a Scottish trade body, but we are, rooted into the strategic energy planning that is taking place across the UK at this time. So we kind of look at that quite busy and cluttered landscape, and we're kind of looking for that clarity, as you say, as to kind of what is the direction we're pulling in. And I think, industry would be very willing to get around the table for a discussion on what are our good outcomes, what are we striving towards, and how can we make sure that the landscape that we're operating in, not necessarily, as I say, kind of losing very valuable time on reform that we're not particularly engaged with, but actually looking at that broader energy planning which is taking place too, and where does that fit into that process?
Paul, I'm going to come to you last, because I think you would need to declare an interest with this question. Sandy, again, can I really just pitch the same question? Given the importance of financial services, do you have clarity about the kind of where the inputs will be for industry, and whether or not you think there is sufficient interface with industry in the proposed structures?
No, I would say it wasn't. I would agree with when the panel said. I think that the proposals are, they're about structure, and I don't think that really deals with what Paul said is a crisis that we face. I think every industry has been calling out skills for years now. It's been consistent, even pre-COVID, but certainly post-COVID, it's been even greater. So I think it's not obvious how that employer voice will be raised. James recommended having a national employer board as part of that recommendation. I think, well, obviously we've got SAB, but there is a need to have a louder voice. I've written down here, going back to my supply and demand, I think demand needs to be employer-led. I think that needs to be employer-led. The supply side, with support from government on the supply side, so that actually how the system responds needs to be government-led, but with employers' voice absolutely involved in that. And at the moment, I don't feel as though we've got that anywhere near right. So I think moving the funding that's not going to transform the system. It's not going to address the challenges that you've heard about this morning.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, I'd just like to pitch a slightly different question. I mean, you are here representing SAB. SAB has essentially been scrapped. Has it been articulated to you as to what SAB wasn't doing or why it wasn't working, and therefore why it has been scrapped?
Not explicitly. So I think when you look at the Withers report, it suggested that was a fragmentation in the system. Actually, we would look at it as being, when you look at the Wood Commission, which was an earlier report, it said more focus had to be put in apprenticeships, and SAB was a response to that, to bring employers together to give that real focus and energy, which it has had. We've been working constructively with government in relation to that transition, what that might look like. We understand there's an employer reference network that is being set up. I think the first meetings actually were just issued in the last week or so. What's unclear about that network is how it would function in terms of having a secretariat, how it would actually be managed, how it would lead and influence work streams, if you like. So from a SAB perspective, SAB is very focused on deliverables and actually delivering outcomes as part of what that group does at the moment, and that's less clear. And the other thing that was obviously put in the bill was the Apprenticeship Committee as a subgroup of SFC board. And at the moment, I think it was Sandy that mentioned it earlier, or Paul, but it's unclear how much industry representation there is on SFC just now. That feels like a bit of a gap, and there's a bit of a concern that might feel like a kind of subset rather than being integrated, which I think is the intent of the review. It might feel like something that's kind of sitting off to the side. So it's kind of unclear about how it will all function. From a SAB perspective, I think what you have in that group is, I mentioned earlier, 80 relatively senior and very senior employers across Scotland who are actively involved in the system, who are very passionate about apprenticeships, and who at the moment, to be honest, are operating with a lot of goodwill to try and keep the wheels on the bus. Because SAB is not just employers coming together to talk, it is the Standards and Frameworks Group that approve the standards that are required for apprenticeships, design the frameworks. It is the Apprenticeship Approvals Group, AG, again, employers front and centre of that, approving the apprenticeships that go into production and get delivered in the system. The Apprentice Engagement Group, so apprentices themselves having a voice in the system as part of SAB and being able to make themselves heard. I believe they were at the Parliament recently just for Scottish Apprenticeship Week. So SAB is more than just employers coming together to talk. It is the frameworks, it is the apprenticeship approvals, it is all of those things. And what conversations we have had with government is to say we don't have complete certainty in terms of how all that will function. So from a SAB perspective, we are continuing and we are continuing to do what we do until such times, I suppose, as we know that everything is going to function well and apprenticeships are going to continue to flourish in Scotland.
So when we are at sort of at the end of our evidence taking, and so I've got, rather than questions, I've got one or two sort of propositions I'd just like to put to the panel, just sort of really reflecting my thoughts. I'm going to ask one of you to sort of volunteer rather than, because otherwise I won't have enough time. The first proposition I've had, I think one of my reflections is I think we treat apprenticeships and skills as a bit of a monolith. And it's not. And I think in particular, I think one of those elements where we view it as this is you don't end up with one qualification. Actually, apprenticeships are a method of learning. I was just wondering if people on the panel would agree with the proposition we need greater clarity actually on the qualifications people end up with, not just treating apprenticeships as the thing. Just, i.e., is it an NVQ, sorry, SVQ that people end up with? You know, is it actually degree level and various qualifications in between? Do we think we need to be a little bit more refined in how we understand what apprenticeships deliver in terms of qualifications? Would that be a fair? I don't know which. Paul, you seem to be.
I see Paul.
You seem to be left standing, and everyone has stepped back.
Well, I see Paul nodding, but I mean, my own view on that would be that apprenticeship frameworks are actually really clear in terms of outcomes, in terms of national occupational standards and the qualifications that are within them, whether that's a SVQ or whether it's a vocational related qualification or whether there are other ancillary and additional qualifications like higher education that might form part of that. So the frameworks are really clear in terms of what is in them. So I think from a Scotland perspective, that's a real strength, actually, in terms of being really clear in terms of the qualifications that are in them. Paul, I don't know if you were going to agree. Or...
It's just nowhere near the Pareto of list of things to do about skills. It's not a big enough issue. I'm sure there'll be issues with it. There are fine tweaks and so on, but we're nowhere near that. You know, that's down at 100 feet off the ground. We're up at 20, 30, 40,000 feet here.
So the second thing, which maybe is a bit more into this space, is I wonder, having reflecting on the evidence that we've taken, that we actually need to almost flip some of the priorities on its head, and rather than asking, you know, for more consideration, we need to be challenging every aspect of the education system to demonstrate what they're delivering skills. So it's not good enough for universities to turn around and say, you know, your skills requirements aren't our business. We actually need to be actually challenging primary, secondary, and all tertiary education. How are you contributing to skills outcomes?
I think the outcome point is really important. I think that you know, I've always maintained in this space money is not the issue. You know, we invest billions both from government and from private sector in this, and you know, if if that was a standalone business, it would be a substantially sized business, and I just don't think I don't think the outcomes that we get from that level of investment are good enough. Yeah. So I think that you talk about turning itself on its head. I think we need to get much more focused around how do we change the outcomes, because there is an emergency. Spending the next 1 year, 2 years changing how the system works, or moving some of the people around and moving some of them around isn't going to really drive out different outcomes. I would suggest. I might be wrong, but I've got a background in transformation. That's not how you go about. That's not how you go about doing it. You aim to articulate what are the outcomes, the changes that you want to deliver.
Yes.
And then how do you then think about how the system then needs to change quickly to deliver those outcomes? So,
I mean, one of the things I've said directly to both the Minister and James Withers is we put structure ahead of function.
Yeah.
And outcome. Is that a sort of a fair assessment?
Yeah.
Paul, you.
Yeah, I mean, the structure against ahead of function, I think, is a good way to look at this. And I think there is. I think we have to be careful. You can look at anything in life and look for where it's improved, and you should. But you have to be careful. At the other hand, is what you end up trying to do is boil the ocean. And we are in a situation where we have to go for a less is more approach. We need to do less things well, and we need to do them really well if we want to have the impact that we need to have in order to avert a crisis. You know, in that crisis, you have to pick the 3 or 4 things that you need to do well and go for them.
I'm going to come back and ask you what you think those are, because I feel, Paul, you want to get those off your chest. Can I just put the last proposition? Look, we've heard quite a lot about the sort of balance between the big employers and the SMEs. The big employers are overwhelmed with applicants. SMEs struggle sometimes to engage with the system. Do we need more of a, I'm just going to, more of a sectoral approach? And Paul, I know in advanced manufacturing there's been some moves in that direction. Likewise in construction, we've got long-standing kind of collaborative bodies. Do we need more sectoral approaches to help sort of balance and help firms of different sizes and engage with the system more effectively?
So the SMEs are part of that 50-to-1 ratio, yeah. So there's no issue from that. I think there's always a need for sectoral approaches, but really this is systemic, because right now construction, take the example of Hinkley Point C, is a black hole that sucks resource and skills into it and pays them very well. You could say that, you know, in the near future, Barrow will be the same and closer to the border with Scotland. I think we're already seeing that in the north of Scotland, you know, around the activities and around the port of Nigg and Cromarty Firth. And so, you know, anecdotally, you meet people who say it used to be easy to get a hotel room in Inverness and now less so because there is so much activity going on. So I think we need to be careful, because when we talk about these skills, whether it be house building or whether it be, you know, manufacturing, electrical skills, electronic technician skills, welding, fabrication, these are systemic, and so we need to fill a bigger pipeline. We need to make sure that that bigger pipeline is more full, because everybody is fighting for the same sparse skills.
So just finally, Paul, what are, you know, your top 3 or 4 things to hit that Pareto point that you...
Nothing new. We are on the wrong path. Smashing Skills Development Scotland into the Scottish Funding Council will stop any progress on skills while we spend money and time and effort and resource to do that. I believe it's the wrong way around. I think there's even a question of is this the right timing. But while that happens, we will have our eye off the ball of the bigger picture, which is we have a skills crisis which is worsening. We need to make tougher decisions on where we spend the money that is available and divert it to work-based learning and apprenticeships.
So, I mean, just for clarity, so you're arguing there that we should be diverting money from you know, other post-school education destinations, i.e. university colleges, towards the skills system?
Yes.
Yeah. I'll leave it there, Convener.
Very clear. Thank you indeed for that. Last question to Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Hi, thank you to the panel for coming in. I think it's been extremely interesting today. Can I? There's a couple of kind of areas I wanted to have a look at, and I'll maybe kind of finish on a follow-up to what Daniel was asking there. Paul Campbell, if I can just come back on the SAB question, because it was touched on. Cromarty Firth obviously was touched on just there. Delivering skills in areas like mine, the Highlands and Islands, is very different to delivering skills and apprenticeship and training in other parts of Scotland. I know that the proposals in the Withers report looks at regional skills councils. Do you think that is enough to ensure that regional input is there, or are you or anybody else have concerns that we'll lose some of that regional input and expertise?
I honestly don't know, to be honest. I think you need both, don't you? You need regional consultation and engagement and involvement to understand local needs, but you need a national approach as well, which really focuses on making the best possible use of the available budget that you have. And that's a bit of an unknown at the moment, Jamie. I'm sorry, I'm not.
Okay, I'll come to everything else. I mean, one of the concerns that's come up time and time again, I met with Sarah Max during Apprenticeship Week. One of the issues was housing, one of the issues was transport. Again, those are going to be areas of real concern or difficulty in different kind of bits. I suppose it's that kind of aspect that concerns me, that you know, it's all right taking decisions from Central Belt and saying, well, you know, this is what we want to deliver in this area, but we know there's going to be an overheating around Cromarty Firth at the moment, because there's going to be so much work hopefully going there. Yep. So I suppose I would say you're not confident that that this potential new approved loss of SAB will be able to deliver that input.
I think losing SAB will impact it potentially negatively, yes. I think, going back to Paul's point about SDS are actually pretty good at that, in terms of demand forecasting, labour market analysis, looking at sector skills issues. They are strong in collaboration, employer engagement. So I think SDS actually have a lot of the capabilities that you would need to get in and do that work. So that is something that definitely needs more focus, both nationally and regionally. But it all comes back to the quality of the labour market information, the demand analysis, and the integration of employers within that, both regionally and nationally. So it's the quality of insight and information, and you need a good intermediary or intermediaries, as Daniel was kind of alluding to be able to do that work and have the right relationships.
Okay. Does anybody else want to come in on that? Paul? Oh, sorry.
For me, it's not an either or. I hear a lot of conversation which is, it's national at the expense of regional or local, or it's regional at the expense of national. I just don't see it that way. I think it's not impossible to work a model which takes account of local individual needs, local economies, and the skills that are needed there, right up to sectors. If you take financial services, the bulk of employment is in the Central Belt. Yeah. I've said to, you have a conversation with, someone in Edinburgh will say, I think we need a skills strategy for Edinburgh's financial services. I'm like, no, we don't. We need a skills strategy for financial services. We have one. What we don't need is an Edinburgh one. And so I think it's about coming up with a model that can accommodate both. But it's not possible. I mean, businesses do this all the time in terms of local autonomy and then what makes sense to look at it on a more macro level.
Okay.
Just to go back to the regional versus national, I think the point made was that it needs to be in balance is absolutely right. There needs to be regional economic considerations, but it has to be national programmes. And I would say I sit on, some skills bodies which are UK-wide, and it's been one of the feedbacks that we've had from that is as a part of the fall, that 40% fall in apprenticeships in England has been due to regionalisation from skill policy point of view, and I think it's one to watch out for.
Okay. Jed, do you want to comment on that?
Just to agree, and I think you can take that place-based approach as well in terms of recognising, your core sectors which are pulling towards kind of national strategic objectives, but play to your regional strengths in doing that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, of course. I've been given an appointment, so can I depart? It's not easy always to get an appointment, so thank you.
If I can kind of, I suppose, make a statement which I'm going to ask you to kind of agree with or disagree with. Sorry, I'm not trying to push you either way. Previously, and it follows up again, other questions have been asked, particularly with Murdo Fraser. Previous panellists have said, look, if actually what we're seeing is a system where there isn't enough of funding for apprenticeships, therefore we're not seeing enough places. So people applying for apprenticeships, they're not getting them, they're then going into college, then might even go on to university, and they're ending up roughly where they would have done if they'd just been able to do an apprenticeship in the past. And it's costing potentially more money, but it's also meaning that we don't get people into the workplace, much needed people into the workplace. Is that something you would agree with, disagree with, or have any additional insight on?
I'm going to go first on that. There's a bit of it I don't agree with, which is if they go to college and then go to university, it's a different skill set from the one which we predominantly need. Work-based learning, hands-on learning in the skill sets, what we would in the past call trades, that's our fundamental need. It's our biggest gap. It is, to repeat, it's our welders, it's our electricians, it's our electrical fitters, it's our mechanical fitters, it's our electronic test technicians. Those are different skill sets. Universities, rightly, are not set up to train for that capability and capacity. And so it's a loss, yes, to industry, and it leaves us with the gaps that we've got now. There's a reason why when we started off consulting on what that skills gap survey was last year, the feedback was it's all about work-based learning, it's all about modern apprenticeship, which is why we ended up choosing 24 out of the 31 roles to focus on as being in those. And those are two different things, and the need is greatest in the 24. So I hope that helps and answer your question.
It does. I mean, I think probably these were more focused on those that can be delivered, but I absolutely agree with that. Jack?
Just to agree on behalf of the renewable energy industry as well, in terms of absolute that foundational ways of getting into the workforce, absolutely. And I think we then can back that up with kind of that coming back to the first points on agility and being more responsive in terms of kind of strategic interventions you could make on the reskilling that will have to take place in a future workforce as well.
Paul?
I agree in part, I think. Certainly do hear of that happening. And I think when it does happen, and if that's a young person who's left school, doesn't get an apprenticeship, decides to go to college, then university, you could be looking at quite an extended period of time before that young person actually enters into the workplace. So, college, then into maybe year 3 of a degree, maybe they want to go into honours, then they probably want a gap year, might come back and do a master's, 6 years later they're going in the workplace. That costs money. If there was an apprenticeship position available or a graduate apprenticeship position available, they would be working from day one. They would be paying tax, they would be paying national insurance, they wouldn't be incurring debt, and this system would be funding that in a different way, and employers would be getting more of what they probably need in the areas that we need it.
Yeah. Okay, and my last kind of question, again, it's a kind of agree or disagree. I mean, you know, this part of this inquiry is hopefully going to help with a kind of direction of the future. But if things go the way they seem to be going, and we've heard some of the concerns of that, do you have confidence that we'll meet the skills need that Scotland has?
Well, first, on the current path we're on, no.
Jack?
There are successes to recognise, but I think the challenges that we face are enormous, and I think require real agility again and innovation in how we tackle them. But there are real concerns across your kind of key enablers of project deployment in terms of the kind of barriers that we face in other parts of basically getting a project off the ground. But in terms of the barrier that we're going to hit with people, real concern.
Thanks, Paul.
I think there's a lot of good intent in terms of reform and what it's trying to do. I think SAB, from a SAB perspective, not convinced it's going to give us what we need. I think there are some really difficult decisions that do have to be made in terms of how we use that 3.4 billion most effectively to get what business, the economy, young people, employees need as well. So I think that's the really tricky bit. I'm not sure that what's being proposed at the moment will actually do that. And at the moment, I think I mentioned this earlier, SFC can only recommend what institutions might do in terms of how they use their funding. It's not mandated in any way, so we can't be very deliberate in terms of linking it to the outcomes framework and making sure it's attached to sector needs and skill shortage areas. And the risk is that when you don't have that functioning, you just reinforce some of the things that are already happening in the system.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. And that brings us to the end of the evidence session today. Can I thank our panel very much indeed for joining us this morning and for your insights, which have been incredibly helpful to the committee. So I will now very briefly suspend the meeting before we move on to the next item. Clear up my water as well. Okay, our next item of business is consideration of a Type 1 statutory instrument notification from the Scottish Government on proposed cross-border insolvency enterprise group regulations 2025. The Minister for Public Finance wrote to the committee on the 14th of March to give notice of the Scottish Government's proposal to consent to these UK regulations. UK Government intends to lay the UK SI midsummer autumn. So can I ask, do members wish to make any comment on the Scottish Government's notification? Okay, I don't see any hands, so no comments. Therefore, are members content to agree with the Scottish Government's decision to consent to the UK regulations? All agreed? Okay, thank you so much. I now suspend this meeting and move into private session.